Hi, everyone, and welcome to this session on rethinking academic integrity. We acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the histories and culture of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. We encourage everyone to reflect on these lands from where you are located and the Indigenous peoples for whom these lands are traditional territory. My name is Isabelle de Salaire. I'm the Dean of Business at Memorial University and really delighted to welcome you all to reflect and discuss on an important topic. The event today is hosted by the Faculty of Business Administration in partnership with the Center for Innovation and Teaching in Teaching and Learning, CITL. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for today. We're very lucky to have Dr. Sarah Eaton. She is Associate Professor in the Werklund School of Education and the inaugural Educational Leader in Residence for Academic Integrity at the Taylor Institute of Teaching and Learning at the University of Calgary. Her research focuses on ethics and integrity in higher education. We're delighted to have you here with us today. Dr. Gavin Watson is the Associate Vice President Teaching and Learning for Memorial University. He's also the Director of the Center for Innovation in Teaching and Learning and an adjunct professor in the Faculty of Education at Memorial University. We also have Susan White with us today. She's our communication advisor at the Faculty of Business Administration, and she will convey any questions asked in the chat to our panelists. So Gavin, Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Isabelle. Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, Sarah. Welcome to Memorial University and this session. I just want to start by saying thank you to everybody for joining us this afternoon. It's obviously a topic of importance, and I think that we probably, when we start thinking about values that underlie a university and a university education, I have no doubt, we have a guest star here, my dog, Betty. We have no doubt that integrity is one of those underlying values. And so integrity plays itself out across the institution in many different ways. But as we've discovered, discussed, and lived through the last 24 months, questions about academic integrity have been at the forefront of our teaching and learning enterprise. There's no question that the disruption that came with remote teaching and pandemic teaching has shifted how we think about ensuring the academic integrity of our courses and our programs. The value hasn't changed, but the landscape certainly has. Words that weren't on the tip of our tongues before the start of our remote teaching and learning, things like CHEG or proctored online exams may have existed on the periphery of our awareness, but are certainly front and center as we grapple with the challenges that have come from this kind of experience. And yet we know that while they can be challenges that we face as instructors and faculty members in the classroom, we have a role as educators to not only ensure the integrity of our assessments and our courses, as well as our programs, as part of our relationship and our social contract with our larger community, but we also have an opportunity and a responsibility to help our larger community, our students, our learners, understand what their responsibilities are associated with academic integrity. So I'm really excited to have this conversation today with Dr. Eaton, who is, I'm happy to say, and I'm sure will likely poo-poo me, but I will say it anyway, one of the preeminent Canadian scholars when it comes to academic integrity. And we're so really lucky to have Sarah joining us today, and we'll be able to share some perspectives and some of her work related to this. So just to give you a sense of the format of our time together, I'm going to soon turn the floor over to Dr. Eaton, who has a very short set of slides to help set the scene, as it were, as far as our conversation. We'll come back together again, and we'll engage in a conversation. This is a question and answer. And so I'll pose some questions to Sarah and we'll have a conversation. There is the opportunity to post questions in the chat. I know that we talked about waiting into the last 15 minutes. If and as we can pause and stop and have a look at those chat feeds, we'll take some questions from the floor. I'd like this to be as interactive as possible, and I suspect that many of you you've come with questions or will be inspired to ask questions based on what you hear. So we're lucky that we have over an hour together, and obviously we'll have the opportunity to get through a number of different questions and think through some of the challenges that, and also perhaps our lived experience over the past little bit. I know I've been talking about the pandemic and talking about looking back over 24 months. I really do think that the opportunity here is to take stock of how we want to move forward and consider how to support learners to adhere to our standards of academic integrity, but also think about what our role and responsibility is as educators to help students understand what their responsibilities are, but also what our own responsibilities as far as course and assessment design are concerned in order to ensure that students are able to maintain the integrity that we're asking them to do so. Had an interesting thought as I was saying that. If you want to play a game, just keep a quick tick box of every time that somebody says integrity, and we'll just see how far, how many times it gets mentioned within the next little, within our time together. All right, on that note, I am going to turn the floor over to Dr. Eaton. Sarah, welcome. The floor is yours.
Terrific. Thanks so much. As Gavin mentioned, I am situated at the University of Calgary in the Werklund School of Education. My field is higher education, leadership, policy, and governance, and I'm seconded part-time to our Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning, where I have this role around inaugural educational leader in residence for academic integrity. Academic integrity is also my area of research, and it's a field where research has been going on for more than half a century, but it's certainly been amplified since about the 1990s, with more people engaging in academic integrity, not only as an area of administrative and professional practice, but also of scholarly inquiry. And that's where I situate my scholarship. I'm joining you today from what is now my home city of Calgary. I came out here in 1993. I grew up on the East Coast. I was raised in Halifax, did my undergraduate degree at St. Mary's University, came out to Calgary to do graduate work, and then got a job and became one of those Easterners who came west and stayed. But unlike my friends and colleagues from the oil patch working in higher education, I'm here for good now. So I'm joining you from the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 in southern Alberta. So that includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, Piikani, Kainai First Nations, and I further acknowledge that the peoples of these lands include the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. And my hometown now, the city of Calgary, also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. And I start with this land acknowledgement not only as part of my commitment to truth and reconciliation, but as part of my ethical practice as a scholar. So we have what you see on our screen here is actually a stock JPEG that we are allowed to include on all of our slide presentations. But we engage in this practice of reflecting on the land that we're situated on as part of our ethical commitment to truth and reconciliation, rather than simply as some words that we recite at the beginning of a meeting or an event like this. So I wanted to start by situating academic integrity as part of ethical practice. The foundation of this work is informed by scholars like Don McCabe, who was one of the co-founders of the International Center for Academic Integrity, now celebrating its 30th year. McCabe and his colleagues came up with a framework of fundamental values around academic integrity. It's recently been updated. It's in its first iteration, there were 5 fundamental values. And then, I think it was around 2010, 2014, they added the 6th, and the 6th one was courage. So now we find ourselves with our work rooted in these 6 fundamental values of courage, fairness, honesty, respect, responsibility, and trust. Those of you who study universal values will find that some of these align with that broader discourse around universal values, and also offer a point of departure for a productive conversation with students and with colleagues. But I don't see these values as being obsolete. So much of what we do when we talk about academic integrity is framed as a matter only of student conduct and student responsibilities. And I'll show how the conversation has been broadening, certainly in the past 10 years or so, to include more of a multi-stakeholder approach. I'll talk a little bit more about that throughout, but wanted to go back to this idea of these values not being absolute. So I'll highlight one example for you, and that's responsibility. Many of our institutional policies and procedures will talk about the student's responsibilities. It is the student's responsibility to know the policies and procedures, which sometimes they can't even find on our websites. It is the student's responsibility to act with integrity. It is the student's responsibility not to commit misconduct, for example. And I just wanted to kind of pause there a little bit and unpack some of the language. So when we talk about academic integrity, it's not a synonym for academic misconduct. When I hear colleagues say, I'm dealing with a case of academic integrity, I say, no, you're not. You're dealing with a breach of academic integrity or a violation of academic integrity or misconduct. But we don't deal with integrity. We promote it, we encourage it, we uphold it, but we don't deal with it or investigate it. Going back to this idea of responsibility, students themselves may find themselves with conflicting responsibilities. For example, students may have a responsibility to social or peer groups to help their peers, or share academic work with their peers, or share answers with their peers. This may be a social pressure or a peer pressure that is very real for our students. Sometimes when I bring up that example, colleagues will challenge me and immediately speak about students from other cultures or other countries. But, and this is a big but, we find this practice of student and peer sharing has been alive and well in our North American context for, we have evidence going back to at least the 1950s. And there was a practice or phenomenon known as frat files. Now that's a pejorative term, but it refers to the practice of members of fraternities and sororities having an obligation to share with other members copies of tests, exams, papers. This was has been a very common practice. In the old days, the frat files were held in paper boxes, like maybe photocopy paper boxes in the basement of the fraternity or sorority house for other members to refer to and use for years or decades after people had completed their courses. Now, of course, those files exist in online spaces, Google Drives, etc. And we've also seen the infiltration of commercial entities that have overtaken file sharing. But file sharing among students is not new. It is not restricted to students from other countries. It's a practice that's been alive and well for a long time. And I offer that example not to disparage Greek societies in any way, because I know that they also offer a lot of positive aspects to their members, but merely to highlight that the practice of file sharing among students is not new. It did not start with the pandemic. It did not start with the advent of the internet, and it is not restricted only to students from other places. So these values are not absolute, but they do provide us as a starting place to frame conversations with students and others from a proactive stance that focuses on the behavior that we expect to see from our students. And I noted that this session started today with conversations in your business school. There is more and more research being done about the connection between academic integrity in our classrooms and ethical practice within our professions. So a productive way to frame the conversations with students can be setting the stage of this is not about not cheating or not plagiarizing or only following the rules, but rather this is the foundation for your ethical decision-making beyond the classroom, whether it's in a profession that has a code of conduct like engineering, nursing, or some of the business professions, or it's simply part of the day-to-day decision-making that you engage in. So that can be a way for it to help students understand why we do this and why it's important within our school context. Because I'm a scholar in this space, I look at conceptual framing of this work, and we can see that framing of academic integrity from both scholarship and practice can be viewed within one of sort of three broad lenses. The first is a bit of seeing it as a moral issue. So you might hear words or phrases such as academic dishonesty. Certainly in the first half of the 20th century, this is where scholarship really began to sort of take hold, and moral and social psychologists began studying profiles of cheaters, for example, academic cheaters, what were the personality traits of cheaters, etc. So that was sort of up until about the 1950s or 60s, where research was largely dominated by folks in, as I said, moral and social psychology. And then in the 1960s, there were some shifts, mainly in the United States, but they had an impact on us in Canada. And due to the social protests that happened on American campus during the 1960s for a variety of reasons, universities tried to engage in behavior control to curb some of the protests on campus and what they deemed to be improper behavior among students. And because of that, some students in the United States took their universities to court, and the students won. The U.S. courts relieved universities of what was called their in loco parentis function. So universities had no legal right to act in place of parents and guide students' moral character development or behavior. So at that point, in the mid to late 1960s, notions of character development were dropped across U.S. campuses very quickly, and then Canada followed suit not long afterwards. What replaced behavior guidelines for students and code books of behavior, etc., were policies and procedures. We didn't really have too much in the way of policies and procedures at all before the 1970s or 1980s, from what we've been able to tell in Canada. So from about the 1980s on, academic integrity became more of a policy issue, procedure issue, etc. Now, many of us also engage in policy analysis, and I'm working with some colleagues now to conduct a policy analysis of academic misconduct policies across Canada. We divided it into phases because there's so many universities and colleges across Canada. And I'm happy to tell you that we're working on one for Atlantic Canada, including working with a colleague from Memorial University of Newfoundland, because we knew we couldn't legitimately do a study on Atlantic Canada without including someone from Newfoundland. And Jennifer Godfrey Anderson from your Faculty of Education is involved in that project. We'll be presenting the results of that at AERA, which is a conference in my field of education for anybody who might be attending AERA. So we're just kind of fine-tuning our results right now. But I can tell you from a policy perspective across Canada, we're pretty outdated. We still take a very punitive approach to this that has lots of leftovers from that age when academic integrity was seen merely as a moral issue that divided students into cheaters and not cheaters. We're doing a lousy job across Canada of addressing contract cheating, for example. There's almost no policy mechanisms to address commercial file sharing. So Gavin mentioned Chegg, Coursera, etc. We don't really have that in our policies yet. So we have a lot of work to do from that perspective. However, we can also say that since policies have been not only an area of focus for practice and also study, in the past 10 or 15 years or so, we've evolved again, now looking at academic integrity as a teaching and learning issue. And we're starting to ask ourselves, what's the role of teaching and learning, and in particular, ethical assessment as part of academic integrity? If we're looking at those values, what is the responsibility of educators and administrators to engage in ethical academic practices around that? And that's not to say we're absolving students of their responsibilities. We're merely layering on additional stakeholders to that. So a key question that a colleague of mine in the United States poses is this, and it's how do we reframe the driving question from how do we stop students from cheating to how do we ensure students are learning? And when we flip the question around cheating on its head and focus instead on how do we ensure students are learning, that's a game changer, because then we start to look at students not as the enemy, but rather as stakeholders in the teaching and learning process, and educators have responsibilities as much as students do. And if our tests and assessments don't actually show us that students are learning, then I think that there's cause for us to maybe rethink our assessments. Because if the focus of assessment is to show us what student learning is like, or one of the areas of assessment is to do that, then we might have some work to do. And I say this because these are conversations that are happening in academic integrity circles broadly and globally. Last year, I worked with a couple of graduate students to develop sort of what we call the academic integrity continuum. And we see this as sort of on the left-hand side of your screen there, where we talk about academic integrity breaches, what's traditionally been known as misconduct, including an investigation, case management, sanctioning of students, subsequent appeal processes. Generally in Canada, we have these processes at most of our publicly funded post-secondaries. Students may come from places where there are no such policies that are transparent to them. Students can be legally charged in other countries if they commit plagiarism, for example, and there can be criminal consequences. It's not a criminal offense in Canada to engage in academic misconduct. However, there have been cases from our post-secondary institution where degrees have been rescinded after graduation based on retroactive findings of misconduct. Then at the other end, we have academic integrity, which is more proactive, has a more teaching and learning focus. We look at education, skill building, communication of our expectations. So we've got this whole broad continuum around integrity and what it means. But for most of us as professors, we would find if we're dealing with a case of misconduct that there's probably a critical incident where there is either an alleged or an actual misconduct that we think might merit investigation. And then we would probably refer it to either a department head, an associate dean, or somebody else charged with the responsibility of investigating possible misconduct. There can also be a lot of gray area in there where an individual isn't sure if there's been misconduct, and if they think there has, they're not sure who to report it to or what to do about it. There's a whole sort of body of literature around the stress, the emotional labor involved with reporting a case of academic misconduct. And certainly for those who have precarious employment, this can be especially scary for them if they're in a position where that they might feel they're jeopardizing their employment if they make waves. And it has been traditional that professors see their job as starting at that moment of a critical incident, and that their job is only to report alleged misconduct. But now that we understand that teaching and learning plays an important role, we also understand that the faculty roles and responsibilities include the right-hand side of the continuum for academic integrity. That includes considerations for talking to students about academic integrity proactively, helping them understand expectations, for assessment, what is okay for them to do, what is not okay for them to do, providing them with opportunities to practice skill building, such as citing and referencing before they hand in their final paper to you, offering formative assessment on their papers so that citing and referencing can be corrected before they get to the summative stage of their assessments. For example, there's lots of things we can do to help students understand what do we expect when we talk about academic integrity, and then support them through their skill building as they do that. Now, in addition to our classrooms, we know that there's other units on our campuses that provide students with those opportunities, and also to build skills around time management, for example. But my challenge is that these opportunities for skill building should not be only designated to the student affairs office or the library, for example, but there's also space in each and every classroom for us as instructors to talk to this about our students. And this is why we now, scholars in the space that I work in, promote a multi-stakeholder approach in which, again, students are not absolved of their responsibilities for upholding academic integrity and acting with integrity, but we also have expectations for integrity from our instructional staff. I use faculty there inclusively to include full-time, part-time, and possibly even teaching assistants there as well, and in particular for ethical assessment, ensuring that expectations are clear. And that includes things like, giving an open book exam and saying to students, oh, anything goes. It's okay, use whatever you want. And then the students go to an online source to find the answers. And then the prof says, well, you've cheated on my exam. And the students say, no, you told us it was open book and we could use anything. To the students, that means that they had permission to go and engage in collaborative answer finding, looking online, unless we specifically tell them it is not okay to use any materials that are outside your assigned textbook or our learning management system. That when we talk about open book, this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about it being a free-for-all. Lots of students will need to have that explained to them, and it's not self-evident. And then in terms of administration, setting the stage, of course, for ethical leadership, And these are big systemic things, right? We can't solve all of this today, but kind of setting the institutional expectations that if we're asking students to act with integrity, then it is incumbent upon us as the educators and administrators of the institution to do the same, and also the staff and community stakeholders. I add this one in here because I'm not sure what it's like at your university, but at my university, we're seeing more and more parents get involved in cases of allegations of misconduct. And back early as 2012, researchers were talking about the need to engage parents as partners for academic integrity, so that parents are not coming in, in an adversarial way only when there's an allegation of misconduct, but really that we're also encouraging the parents to have these productive conversations with their students. This is why we want to have parents, alumni, students, and members of our institution as allies rather than adversaries to promote academic integrity. Now, if you're interested, all of this, I've got the references here for the slides today. I'm happy to connect with any of you about the topic. As I mentioned, this is my area of research and also professional practice. So I'm happy to connect. I'll stop sharing the slides for now so we can have a bit more of a chat.
Thanks, Dr. Eaton. A rich slide deck, or at least a rich opportunity for thought from a very short slide deck. So thank you for putting that together for us. One of the things that I was struck, not being a scholar of this literature, was that there is a North American history of looking at this as an object of study for over 100 years. One of the senses that I got from my conversations with colleagues over the past two was that this is a pervasive and relatively frequent occurrence, deviations from academic honesty. And so I'm just also then noting that you talked about the idea that this is a moral issue. And then I connected to this notion of moral concerns and even literature around moral panics. I think we've seen these in different ways. And so I just wonder if you can talk a little bit about any sense of the actual pervasiveness or frequency that we see around student cheating or deviations from academic honesty. In short, is it more pervasive now than it was 20, 40, 50 years ago?
Okay, so the second part is easiest to answer, and it's no. The actual percentage is unclear because some of it doesn't go reported. So even though there's an expectation that PROS will report, there's still 40 to 50% of incidences that don't get reported. However, what I've seen for undergraduates, for example, like 75 to 90% of students will engage in misconduct of some form or another. It might be minimal. In some schools, students might get called up for misconduct if they miss a citation, for example, or they make an error in citing and referencing. So using a comma instead of a period in a reference for some could be considered misconduct. That for me, like, it's a really minor offense, right? Versus I'm going to buy my assignment from an online provider of assignment completion services. That to me is much more intentional. So when we look at these stats, we should also think about intentionality, what's considered a minor infraction versus a major infraction, and so on and so forth. I will also say that there's different sort of stances around the morality issue. So certainly in some of the US-based literature and practices, we see things like character being talked about, character development, etc. And then from Australia and the UK, they see it as a behavioral issue. And it's a lot easier to correct behavior than it is to correct somebody's bad character. There's a book just called Cheating by a woman named Deborah Rohde, which is, I think, fantastic. She talks about all kinds of cheating, from financial fraud to relationship cheating to academic cheating. And she presents it as what seems obvious after you read it as a bell curve, where at one end you have 5 to 10% of people who will never engage in cheating of any kind. At the other end of the bell curve, we've got 5 to 10% of people that can't be helped. They're going to be the serial cheaters. And then we've got the main part of the bell curve where we've got about 80% of the people that might be influenced by situational or contextual factors. I think the problem with academic misconduct is that we assume that our students are in that 5 to 10% of serial cheaters, when in fact they're probably falling into the normal part of a bell curve. Does that help?
Yeah, that does. Thank you. The other question that I then think about with the notion of pervasiveness or frequency is then differences across disciplines, and wonder if there are any notable differences in student deviations from academic honesty in different disciplines that you can speak of or to.
Yes, there has been research done over time that shows that there are particular faculties where students might engage in more misconduct, specifically engineering and business. I'm sorry to say. I can't comment specifically on business, but in engineering, there has been discussions about excessive workload, for example, that is pretty typical in some engineering problems as being contributing factors to student misconduct. Where if students are overloaded with an excess of work, they may not have time to do it properly, and therefore looking at cheating, unethical collaboration, etc., might be a survival mode for students if they're really put in a position where they absolutely can't complete the amount of work demanded of them. And in terms of business schools, typically in the research, that has been one of the areas where it's been shown that students might engage more than other faculties. However, I will go back and sort of offer a little bit of a caveat there. I come from a school of education where we actually have trouble getting our colleagues to report academic misconduct because they want to deal with it individually. They don't want students to be called up for academic misconduct, so they just give them a warning. And so we need to differentiate between the misconduct that gets reported and the misconduct that actually happens. It could be that professors in a business faculty and engineering faculty are actually more diligent about reporting it, whereas in our caring professions and caring faculties, we may not report it because we may feel that it jeopardizes the future of our students. So I think that there's a little bit of disparity there in terms of what gets reported versus what gets committed.
Thanks. Interesting to think about even how disciplines consider and understand themselves can impact, in fact, reporting related to potential misconduct cases. Fascinating. So I promised that we would engage folks in Q&A, and so I think this is a good time to pause. I did promise Dr. Tulit the first question, and so David, go ahead, please.
If I can describe what the situation is, because things have pre-pandemic. Well, first of all, thank you for your presentation. Let me say that first. There was like 10% for assignments, 2 midterms at 20 each, a final exam worth 50%. And if somebody cheated on the assignments, well, what would it profit them? They wouldn't learn a thing in the course. And so they get 9 out of 10 on that, and then they get 10 out of 90 on the rest of it. So it was never an issue. Now, in the pandemic, we've switched to 100% assignments. So the opportunity for cheating is now there in a way it wasn't before. But if it does occur, of course, it affects the whole mark. I don't go looking for cheating, and I don't assume people are cheaters, but sometimes I have a TA who brings it to my attention, and we're not just talking about somebody not using a proper stylistic reference or something. I'm talking about people who have word for word cut and pasted from one assignment into another, and then sometimes they even cut and pasted the other student's name. So it's pretty blatant. So I have to deal with it when it occurs. I have a course that's with right answers. So if the profit is $34,025, well, if people get the right answer, I can't possibly assume they're cheating because that's right, the answer I want them to get. It's only when people make mistakes, they make the same identical mistake. So anyway, that's what I'm doing. I'm not looking for cheating, but I have to deal with it when it exists. Now, you got any suggestions how I could do it better than what I'm doing?
Yes and no. I don't have details on the course you teach in terms of how big it is. Certainly the size of courses can impact the ways in which we assess students, and large classes, large lectures, mega lectures can pose particular challenges for profs. And I have heard of instances where folks are using tools, sometimes within an LMS and otherwise, for mathematical equations where the test itself will generate just a slightly different variable for each student so that the answers are different, so students can't really copy from them. And there are automated programs that will do that now. Then the answer is also automated. And I'll just take one little pause and comment on something around the student sharing and the cutting and pasting. And so one thing I think we have seen more in recent years with the rise of social media anyway, I'd say in the past 10 years, is I would suspect that young people are not necessarily understanding online sharing behaviors as a form of academic misconduct. So if you're like me and you went to school before the internet was commercialized, then of course it seems obvious that you shouldn't cut and paste stuff from the internet. But our students today engage, and so do we, engage in so much online sharing. I share status updates, I retweet posts, I share memes, we share YouTube video clips, and we cut and paste all the time. And students may not understand that the behavior that they engage in online socially is not the same as we expect them to engage in for learning. And that simply because you share something doesn't mean you've learned it. And again, that seems totally obvious to us. And when I talk with students anecdotally and informally, they are genuinely perplexed and they don't understand how that this is not okay. And so there might be other things there that we need to explain to them, that it is not okay to copy and paste. It is not okay to share online files, even though you might do it for music and movies and other things. When we're talking about learning, that we expect you to go on your own individual learning journey, and connecting with other people might be something that we ask students. I've had colleagues that say, I now ask students, who did you work with on this assignment? Whether it was meant to be an individual assignment or a group assignment, have them unpack the steps they went through to learn it and declare it. And so I'm not gonna dock you marks if you told me that you worked with Billy or you borrowed his assignment, but I'm interested to know what was your learning process and how did you actually learn what we're talking about. That for us, I think as professors, takes us down a very different journey, because we ask our students then to engage in sort of a metacognitive process about their own learning and a bit of self-evaluation rather than just giving us the right answers. I'm not sure I've given you the right answer, but I hope it's been helpful.
Well, you've brought up another issue about the fact that there are these online sites where people can upload their answers, and then other students can then download from there. And I wonder, should universities be doing something about these sites? Can we take them down somehow legally, or it's just terrible they exist?
David, I can speak to that, and then maybe we'll move on to some other questions. All of these sites that are file sharing sites do have, because the work that gets shared there is faculty members' intellectual property. They fall under, broadly speaking, copyright laws, especially if these are companies that are in the United States. And so there are direct ways of sending takedown orders to take down work. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that it's whack-a-mole. You can only send a takedown once it's been taken and posted. So there is, so there are ways of doing this. And as a sidebar, I've had conversations with Memorial's legal counsel to help craft boilerplate language that can be used by faculty members to send to these sites to get material taken down. So that's something that we can have a further conversation about if you're interested. However, I think with whack-a-mole type approaches, you're always playing catch up. And if we can engage in behaviors, or at least have students consider the behaviors that they can engage in that makes it less likely for them to share this kind of material, then there's less work for us at the back end to have to send these takedowns. Sarah, I don't know if you want to say anything else to that.
Oh, there's so much to say about that. That's probably another whole hour right there. But I'll highlight one aspect of whether it's file sharing or contract cheating that still seems to be new for lots of us in Canada. I think it's worth a mention, and that's that students will pay to not only to download the files, but also they might have to pay a monthly subscription fee. If they're buying their assignments outright, or they're engaging with a so-called online tutoring company, students put themselves at risk because they might not think about the data that they're surrendering to these companies and the impact that can have on them. And one of those impacts is being extorted for additional money by the company. And here's how that works. The company reaches back to the students and said, you registered on our site and you've given us your credit card number, and now we're going to continue to charge your credit card number in perpetuity until the card naturally expires. If you cancel the card or report us to your credit card company, we will report you to your school school for cheating, and we will provide them with all of the documentation and correspondence that you've shared with us to ensure that you are caught for academic misconduct. And the last year, this problem became so pervasive that the Better Business Bureau issued a global scam alert for what they called homework help companies. This is a real threat to students, and there was actually a study conducted by a group in Australia, and I can share that with you too, because again, it's sort of what I do. That students are largely unaware of these risks, and if students are unaware of them, so are professors. And there's the study out of Australia that shows that contract cheating and blackmail is something that students just don't even have on their radar. But when students go onto these sites, they're looking for something, a service, a product, some help of some kind. They give up their information, their email address, their credit card numbers, etc., and they don't realize that the moment they do that, these companies own them. And they will maximize whatever they need to keep generating profit, because they tell the students, these companies don't care about you as a student, they care about profit, and they're predatory. And I don't know if anybody has been following the development with what's been happening with Chegg, but in California, there's now a federal class action suit that's been launched by its own investors for one of the reasons being that they're an academic misconduct cheating company, and that is not a viable business model. So these companies are beginning to, they had a little bit of a heyday, I think, in 2021, and now in 22, they're they have to pay the piper. So Pearson, for example, is also suing Chegg over copyright infringement. They had originally engaged in a partnership. That business partnership fell apart. So some of these companies are now suffering financial loss because of their business models, which focus on copyright violation and academic misconduct. So I put that in there for the business folks. So it's an interesting sort of very, 2 years of history around Chegg. They went up to a $12 billion valuation, and they pretty much tanked.
Yeah, yes, we could spend an hour talking about online academic file sharing, but we won't. There are some great questions coming in the Q&A, Sarah. So I'm actually going to turn the floor over to Dr. Jenna Rosales to ask their question. And before you, as you're unmuting, Jenna, Sarah, I'm gonna, the one question that I do wanna ask that's tied to what David asked you, and we don't need to answer it now, I'm just gonna put it on the floor here, is that what are things, direct actions that instructors can take in their classes to decrease the likelihood of students deviating from academic honesty? Don't need you to answer that right now. I just think that that's something that's probably would be worth hearing. But Dr. Rosales?
Hi, Dr. Eaton. It's really nice to hear everything you have to say. I'm wondering about when universities, had this kind of generic academic integrity module, and then direct everybody, first year students to do that, and then, and very much like any kind of mandatory training that any of us have to do or the students have to do. It's kind of like, well, go to the online module and click through and then you're done. And then as instructors, I think it's very easy for people to treat it as, okay, well, you've done that course, you should know by now. But I'm wondering what you can tell about like the efficacy of doing that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll also put a little article link in the chat, because I went and studied this with a colleague from Ontario. And the analogy I'll use is this, is who among us who've taken first aid training only one time would know what to do if somebody has a heart attack? Or, in a case of a major accident, or gets a gunshot wound. Because the first time I took first aid training, the gunshot wounds weren't included in the training. And that came later on. I think about the 4th or 5th time I had to take that mandatory course. I'm like, wow, okay, first aid has changed since I took it the first time when I was a teenager. So it's this idea of we need to go back and repeat and repeat and repeat. And I did a little bit of analysis of the academic integrity tutorials that are offered across Canadian higher education. And we found that largely institutions might offer these in one of two ways, either as part of pre-arrival orientation activities. And often that was used as a means to do exactly what you said to students, like, well, you've taken the tutorial, now there's no excuse to say I didn't know for misconduct. And then sort of removing that as an excuse for following up or investigating alleged misconduct later, because students would have to take it. The other kind of tutorials we found were the ones that were used as remediation after a finding of misconduct. But in either case, we drew this conclusion that a one and done approach doesn't work. with these tutorials, that students need multiple and repeated opportunities to practice the skills, and they also need to be able to ask questions and have back and forth with their instructors. So in a standalone asynchronous tutorial, that is no replacement for engaging with their teachers, their instructors, being able to ask questions in a safe space, practice their skills through formative assessments. I'm going to tie in a little bit to Gavin's previous question. Honestly, I think formative assessment and students being able to ask questions in a safe space is one of the key ways we can help to show our students that we are there for them in terms of teaching and learning, that we don't see them as the bad guy. We don't see them as, you know, oh, you're going to cheat, so therefore I have to put all of these things in place. I have a colleague in Australia, Kath Ellis, who regularly says at conferences, we can't design out cheating, but we sure as hell can design it in. So we design it in by, for example, recycling our assessments time after time after time. We are being completely naive if we think that the assessments that we create for our students are not available to them in an online format within an hour of them being posted online. So it brings up big challenges for us around assessment, about going back to that question of how do we ensure students are learning. To return to your question around the tutorials, though, in no way would I advocate that an asynchronous standalone one-time tutorial is going to help students build the skills they need to uphold academic integrity in every course they take, including both the required and elective courses through the whole course of their studies.
Thank you. Thanks for that question, Jana. I will unpack two terms that we're using, and I won't assume that everybody knows what they are, but I think they're important to talk about, and that's the difference between formative and summative assessment. And my really quick way that I often talk about differentiating, and Sarah, you can chime in and tell me if you have got a better way, is when you're making a meal, formative assessment is when you add ingredients to the meal that you're making and taste it and realize, well, there's not enough salt. So you add a bit more salt. That's formative assessment. You got the opportunity to change the outcome of the meal based on a round of feedback. Summative assessment is when you serve the meal to your guests and they tell you how wonderful it tastes. You can't change it. It's on the plate. It's there, it's being served. So when we're talking about formative assessment, we're talking about low stakes opportunities for students to get feedback from peers, instructors, to help ensure that they're on the right track, so that when the high stakes testing comes along, they are less likely to feel anxiety and stress. And we could talk about emotions, but Sarah, do you want to add anything to that differentiation?
No, I'd actually never heard that analogy before, and I think it's great. I'm gonna plagiarize it.
That's fine.
I'll give you credit.
Okay, fair enough. I think I got it out of a book. I'll send you the reference.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Let's move on to the next question then, and I believe it's Dr. Richards asking a question. Dr. Richards, I know you were having connectivity issues a little bit earlier. Are you able to unmute your mic and ask your question?
Yeah, the connection seems smoother. I'll keep my video off though, in case that will help. So thanks very much, Gavin. Thanks, Dr. Eaton. So this discussion about formative assessment has been really interesting, and I believe that's what I've been attempting to do. I just didn't call it that in my course. You know, they give up students an opportunity to practice citations, practice paraphrase, and this is in a low stakes online environment where, you know, if they make a mistake, I say, here's the correction, and then we spend a week doing sort of, here's all the plagiarism policies, you know, here's what my expectations are of you, that sort of thing. They also have a orientation piece. These are graduate students, so they do it in orientation. And I still feel like I'm encountering, you know, pretty severe plagiarism by the end of the course. And as you said, there's labor that comes along with that, right? It feels like it takes me 4 times as long to mark an assignment that has plagiarism in it, because I have to, oh, there's plagiarism, okay, I better track down all the websites, sort of make sure my account of this is accurate. Then I have to decide what I'm going to say to the student, sort of the training elements, I got to report it to the dean. There's a lot that goes in there, and I would really like to be able to do more to prevent it. So I've been really leaning towards using plagiarism checking services, but I've heard that there are some ethical concerns about that. So I'm hoping you can speak to that. And I'm wondering if it would make a difference to alleviate any ethical concerns if I was planning to encourage my students to use the same service before they submit as a learning tool.
These are great questions. So I'll answer the last question first because it's the easiest. If one chooses to use such a service, then using it as a formative assessment tool, I think helps students learning, right? We're focusing on student learning then. But I'll add a bit of a but there. And the first one is, okay, so we call them text matching software. So to understand that when you get an originality report or similarity report from one of these services, what they're showing you is a text match. In order to determine if there's actually been plagiarism, then we need a human to analyze that. And I'll use an analogy now. It's like going and getting x-rays done, right? You need someone to take the x-ray, which is like your similarity report, and then interpret it or analyze it. And that's the radiologist, the doctor, right? The technician will never give you your results from your x-ray or your scan because it takes someone with training to analyze and interpret what's really going on. So sitting down and saying, okay, what's going on here with the text match? Is it, and then sort of understanding, is it intentional, unintentional, skill building, all of that. So it doesn't replace human analysis for plagiarism. So I'll start with that. And I'll also add that in Canada, we don't use these services. So I think, a common, oh, there's Georgie. She likes to talk about academic integrity. We don't use these services as ubiquitously, and they do in other countries like Australia or the UK. And there's a reason for that. And that is that it's years ago now, but it's still having an impact. In 2003, 2004, McGill bought a license to Turnitin and required that all students submitted their work through Turnitin. And a student objected, didn't want their work submitted. And the university said, well, you have to, or we're not going to assess your work. And the student took the university to court, and the student won. The courts found that the university was not obliged to have students submit their work to a text matching software, specifically Turnitin. That court case changed the entire trajectory of how services like Turnitin are used in Canada as opposed to other countries. In Australia and the UK, there's partnerships with Turnitin, and it's everywhere. And we don't have that here. However, some schools still use it. At Waterloo, for example, they use it, and they use it in exactly the way you've talked about. And there was a great article in CJ Sodal a few years ago about how text matching software, specifically Turnitin, can be used for exactly what you've talked about, formative assessment. So I think if we're going to use it, a couple of things need to happen. One, profs themselves need to be trained in how to use it. And then I say, take a couple of our own articles, our own theses, run them through Turnitin, have us feel like, what does it feel like to get our own similarity reports? And then if there's been a text match, it doesn't mean that we need to put our own work under the microscope, though maybe we do. Anyway, but to use that as a point of departure for training to understand, what does this mean? What does it feel like to get a similarity report? And then go on and say, how do we then use this for ethical teaching? And there might be cases where we do need to use it for summative or evaluative purposes, but I don't think it's necessarily the first reason we should be doing it. That was long-winded. Did it help?
Yeah, that is helpful. I mean, and I think my follow-up ultimate question is, if I tell students in the syllabus, like, hey, I use whatever service to help me check for plagiarism, because what I really need is help. Like, I'm going to read through it, but I always have this nagging feeling that I'm missing half, and I'm Googling random phrases, and that's making it take longer for me to do. Can I ethically say I'm going to do this and then do that to their assignments without their permission?
I would hesitate to do that to their assignments without their permission. In fact, I would encourage, if you were to go down that road, to not only tell them, but to document that you've told them. Put it in the course outline. Let them know that that you're not engaging in sort of deceptive evaluation practices. Not that you would, but to make it transparent. Look, this is how we assess things, and so forth. I almost think that there's probably cause for a broader conversation, either the department, faculty level, maybe even the institutional level, to think about, if this is going to be used, how is it used, right? From a student perspective, I wonder about students having it in one course, but not in another, and one department, not in another. So I'll refrain from further comment on that, because I think it's probably an internal conversation.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'll also add another piece that's not inherently related to maintaining integrity, but that often comes into play with these third-party tools, and that is intellectual property. In fact, I won't name names, but I'm happy to do so later. Some of these companies, in their terms of service, require that students turn over their IP, aka the essays that they've written, to the third-party tools to be able to be included in their, there's a very clear rationale for it. They include the papers in their against which future papers are matched. But it does require that students give up their rights to their intellectual property. Context is everything, and Memorial's context is very specific. We have a very generous is not the right word, but it's a very strong IP policy that allows faculty, staff, and students to retain control of their own intellectual property. So before anybody would want to start using this at a faculty or institutional level, that would be a big question that I would want to ensure, is that we're not asking students to give up their intellectual property when in fact they have every right to hold on to it. And there's always ways around that, which involve allowing students to opt out, but it is a further factor that can that just doesn't allow for the simple adoption of these kinds of tools, and speaks to ethical practice as well. All right, I believe there's one last, well, that's not one last, no, there's more questions here. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Everman to ask their question.
Yeah, thank you, Gavin, and thank you, Sarah, for taking the time to speak to us. It's been very interesting so far. And I'm not a behavioral psychologist, but to me it seems that cheating or academic dishonesty is an outcome that is motivated by something and that is then enabled or made more likely by other factors. So I'm wondering, is there any research on what the range of motivations is and what the range of these enabling factors is? And more importantly, I guess, is there any research that would show effective strategies to address the problem right at the motivation or right at those enabling factors?
I love this question. Thank you. Yes, I think broadly, I'll summarize some of the research here. It's been divided into individual factors versus contextual factors. So individual factors that might motivate a student could be low self-esteem, low self-confidence. Students might literally believe that they can't say something better than somebody else, so they might as well cut and paste it into their own work, for example. Low skill level, poor time management skills. We know that first-year students tend to engage in more misconduct than fourth-year students, for example, because they may not understand the expectations when they come to university. So whether their high school is down the street or across the ocean, that by and large, secondary schools don't prepare our students properly for their first-year experiences. And then contextual factors. So if students come from family backgrounds where there's pressure to perform, for example. So if parents withhold affection from their students or punish their children for not having high academic performance, that can motivate students to cheat, either to avoid punishment from their family or to win the affection of their parents or guardians. So that can be a motivating factor. If students think their peers are cheating, they are more likely to cheat. So to set up a discourse in our courses where we expect ethical behavior, no, not everybody in this course cheats. It's not a cheat to compete system. So courses that are graded on a bell curve, for example, where there's a limited number of A grades available, there's often more cheating in those types of courses. So eliminating bell curve grading can avoid the cheat to compete syndrome, where some students will do whatever it takes, quite literally, to get the limited number of available A grades. And also if instructor expectations can be a factor. So if students or instructors ignore academic misconduct, refuse to talk about it, or take a punitive approach, or don't care and show apathy, those can be contributing factors. One of the things I do with my students, I tell them right up, I research this stuff, so there's nothing you can tell me, that I don't already know. I've heard about the blackmail, I've heard about Chegg, I've heard about all of it. That I'm like, you're here to learn, I'm here to teach, and if you're not learning, I'm not doing my job. So let's set up some conditions under which you can learn. I have a colleague here at the University of Calgary. She uses a get out of jail free card, puts it in her syllabus. Every student gets a get out of jail free card that gives you a 1-week extension on any assignment, no questions asked. The students have the agency to decide when or if they use their get out of jail card. Interestingly, she tells me that not very many students choose to use their get out of jail free card. If they do, she keeps her end of the bargain and doesn't ask any questions. She's like, great, you've got your 1 week extension, send me your work when you can. So if students have external pressures on them, that they have to work multiple jobs in order to earn enough money to pay their rent, for example, and external pressures, we've seen all of that exacerbated during the pandemic. With students having uncertainty, increased chaos, living in perpetual stress, all of those can be contributing factors. Some of which students may be able to control to some extent, and others they may not be able to control. So to understand those factors, I think when you're talking about there might be certain motivators, you might be talking about things that students can control versus external pressures over which they might have less control themselves. In terms of practical suggestions in our class, some ones I can think of off the top of my head that I know we're going to be controversial and not everyone will agree with this, but I'll throw them out there. One, ditch bell curves for grading. High stakes assessments can also be an enabling factor. So if you have a final assignment or exam worth 50% or more, students may feel that pressure that if they want to pass, then they've got to do this. So ditching the high stakes assessments, providing opportunities for formative feedback for students so they can practice skills, ask questions, get feedback along the way before they get their final grade. All of those things. And then also including some flexibility around deadlines. And I say that because I used to be the most militant person as a young early career academic around deadlines. And I would say things like, in the real world, when you grow up, you have to learn to respect deadlines. Then I became a professor and asked for extensions on all of my manuscripts and all of my conference proposals all the time. And realized that no, I ask for extensions just as much as my students are. So if it comes down to my students needing a couple more days to do the work themselves, or they farm it out to an online service and have someone complete it on their behalf, I'd rather give them a couple of extra days to do the work themselves because they have options now. They can go online, they can order their assignments to be done. They upload the instructions for the assignment course syllabus. The assignment gets formed out to somebody offshore and can be delivered to them literally in 24 hours or less. I'm not interested in grading that kind of work, and I don't think my students should be interested in submitting it.
Thank you. I also want to just share that we've been having conversations at the institution around the fact that our student body is changing and that we are seeing students who are coming with very strong academic records, but we're accepting students that have weaker academic records. And we're, as a result of a strategic plan, looking to center student success in the work that we do, and that comes with a change in practice, and requires that we know something of our students. I just wanted to articulate that some practices that you talked about here, Sarah, around, for example, flexibility around deadlines, are strategies that can be used not only to decrease the likelihood that students would deviate from academic honesty, but actually increase inclusivity so that we're actually able to incorporate students from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different worldviews and ways of knowing, and so that we can encourage folks to be more successful while they're here. And so I think it's worthwhile mentioning that a rising tide floats all boats. We have the opportunity here to change some of our approaches that not only will allow students to be successful, but also sounds like it could decrease the likelihood that students are going to deviate from academic honesty. So I just wanted to make that connection. Just going through the last question here before, well, it's not last, as though we won't ask any more questions. The last question that was posted in the Q&A before I get to dive back into my questions or another question gets posted in the chat is from Dr. Olford. Erin, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. It actually relates to what you were just talking about, Gavin. And hi, Sarah. I was curious if you could speak to the role of the institution. In particular, what I'm interested in is what can administration do to encourage our instructors to embrace their role in protecting academic integrity, and maybe not just encourage, but how can we maybe incentivize our instructors?
This is a great question. Thank you for this. And I will say that it's not easy to incentivize this among instructors. I think we made some good headway here at the University of Calgary. And it was facilitated in part by Florentina Strelchak, right, whom I think you have at Memorial University now, and that she was involved before she left the University of Calgary in the revision of our tenure and promotion handbook. And she and the other lead on that project asked for feedback, and I gave feedback around academic integrity, because when we report it or try and change our assessments to, promote academic integrity or include activities, that's largely invisible work for academics and professors. And I advocated for the inclusion of academic integrity work in our faculty and tenure promotion handbook as being visible and recognized. So we have the 3 sections, right, that are pretty typical: teaching, research, and service. Okay, almost nobody on campus has academic integrity as a research area, so that didn't really apply. But for teaching and research, we actually had it embedded in our institution-wide handbook now, that these are now activities that are recognized for tenure, promotion, and merit. So that means, for example, if somebody wants to document the amount of time that they put into a misconduct case, and if they don't have a formal role for investigating, such as an associate dean, but they're like, I took the time to document this case, and so I put like 20 hours into this. That's real labor. And we need, as an institution, to be able to recognize that. And for teaching, if somebody's redesigning their assessments and they're rethinking how they do their teaching practice, including or developing activities to talk about academic integrity in their classes, that can go into the teaching dossier. That can go, there can be a story told around that of how I am paying attention to this as part of my professional practice. And that there needs to be ways for the institution to create systems which recognize and value the effort that we put in as academic staff into this work. So again, if we're going to ask students to uphold integrity, instructors need to do the same, but then the administration can support that by creating ways to recognize the work.
There is a new question, and Dr. Peters from the Faculty of Engineering has a question for you, Sarah. Dennis, do you want to unmute your mic?
Sure, thanks. And I was going to fess up that, full disclosure, I'm coming from the Faculty of Engineering, and we've just been thrown under the bus for having the worst cheaters on campus. Or maybe we have the ones that get caught most, or what have you. Anyway, but it has to do with the workload, of course. The challenge we face, and I've heard this many times, that we need to reduce the high stakes assessments. And in engineering, it's very typical to have final exams worth 60 or higher percentage, the percent of the course grade. And when I push back on my colleagues and say, can you please try and reduce the instance of that, the response we get from students even is, all of these quizzes, all of these term papers is a huge increase in our workload. So how do we balance that? And I see you've already got a paper posted for me, so I'll copy that now and move on.
Yeah, you're welcome. David de Montigny at the University of Regina is an engineering professor, and he also holds the role of associate dean responsible for investigating student misconduct in the engineering school. So David has written a book chapter in our forthcoming book here on academic integrity in Canada. It should be out here in the next couple of months at most, but he surveyed engineering schools across Canada and asked them sort of these exact same questions. And I appreciated David's work because he came at it as an engineer. So I will be honest, I have less credibility responding to your question as somebody with a humanities and social sciences background. So David's chapter will have clout. But since I was an editor of the book, I've read his draft chapter. And so I can sort of summarize some of the key points that he put in there, which was that this remains a concern across Canada, so you're not alone, and that he advocated as well for rethinking the workload of students and challenging the idea that this does not mean we are watering down our degrees or that there's a threat to the quality assurance of our programs. Again, sort of connected to broader conversations about lifelong learning or work integrated learning, that the idea that we have to sort of cram all of this into our students' heads in order for them to be qualified to enter the profession is kind of a bigger thing. But yeah, the workload in engineering seen as a contributing factor, a big question for sure. And I think it can be tough for us as professors because we start out assessing our students and supervising our grad students in the ways that we were assessed and in the ways that we were supervised, because that's our lived experience. And so for me to wrap my head around authentic assessment and somebody says, well, why don't you try a podcast? I'm like, the hell is a podcast? I know what a podcast is now, but the first time I heard it a few years ago, I thought, what is this? And how could I possibly assess my students if I don't even haven't even lived through the experience of being on the receiving end or listening to a podcast? And it took me a few years to kind of get there. Some of these, I think, are disciplinary conversations that we want to have within our own faculty. So it might be a bigger conversation for you to have in engineering to say, okay, look, we're doing the same thing that we did or we had done to us maybe when we were students. It wasn't right then. It's not right now. And we don't want to keep doing the same things for the sake of it. How do we do it better? I don't have an answer for you as an engineer. I think David's chapter will be interesting, but I think it's probably a great conversation to have in the engineering faculty.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Dennis, do you have a follow-up? Are you okay?
I'm good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, good. Isabel, and David has waved his hand, so I'm going to go to Isabel and then David. And then I'm going to return, Isabel, David, and then I'm going to return to the question that I teased at the beginning, which is strategies to decrease the likelihood of student deviations from academic honesty.
Thanks, Gavin, and thanks, Sarah, for all these insights. Earlier this week, I was participating in a panel at a business deans conference, and the topic of our panel was how would we build business education if we could design it from scratch? And a lot of us were saying, well, maybe we free ourselves from programs. Maybe we free ourselves from degrees, We talk a lot about micro-credential. Well, how about if we go even more granular than that and allow people to come in and out of our business schools in the true spirit of lifelong learning, right? When I hear you tell us that we should ensure how students are learning, this is such a powerful question, right? So in this dream that we would have to have kind of open business education where you can, go in and out, maybe the whole discussion around assessment in a sense becomes a little bit irrelevant. I mean, I was even proposing, well, maybe we get rid of the calendar altogether. This might be a little too, but could you speak to that?
Wow. Okay. Talk about a creative disruptor. These are amazing, amazing ideas. And I think that there was a program at the University of Guelph Business School where they had their first year students engage in these grand challenges, right? And the grand challenges included ethical challenges. And I don't know where they're at with that program. We have started kind of something similar at the University of Calgary looking at global challenges. And I think some of that work is facilitated through our Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning, but having students sort of transcend a particular discipline to look at big questions, I think there's every good reason in business where we would, include some of these questions around ethics and having students come at it from an ethical perspective as well in business, right? So a case study of Chegg, or even this whole idea of the commercialization of academic misconduct and the commodification of misconduct. That's a pretty grand challenge. I would love to see some business students dig into that, not in a sense of how do we, propagate and proliferate these predatory companies, sorry for the alliteration there, but in other words, how do we flip it on its head and engage in this as an ethical approach to business, and what does that look like? I would love to see where you take this and the idea of micro credentials for students. I think it's a big question, right? And we've been hearing more and more about micro credentials over the past couple of years. Of course, students will need to be able to take employers' papers to show that they're engaging in their learning, whatever that looks like. And I've heard these broader conversations around ungrading, getting rid of grading systems, and all of that. I think it's kind of exciting and also frightening. I think I would want to be able to ensure students still have their own possibilities for their own futures, right? So when we talk about the possibility of ungrading, like, yeah, but how would we, when I look at graduate admission applications, be able to assess students if they haven't got any grades? It's one of the criteria that's always been used. So that means disrupting admission systems afterwards, and also doing a lot of education for external bodies like employers to understand what we're doing instead. I'm not sure we're there yet. I think the conversations are exciting. And I mean, the whole grading system, Gavin, you might know better than I do. I think it's like maximum 150 years old, maximum. So it's like, what will things look like in the next 150 years? So when people talk to me about exam cheating, I can go back and say, okay, you know, other people in my field have written about exam cheating as having started in the 6th century in China, with big exams that students needed to write if they wanted to get into a government job or get out of universities. And I think, holy smokes, the 6th century, why are we still assessing students the same way they did in the 6th century? Surely we can do better. I don't know necessarily, you know, in some disciplines, exams are still the highest considered way of assessing students. But when we think about what have we done in the past, what can we learn from what we've done in that, and then how do we do it better? Because if students are living in a very different world than they did 150 years ago, I think we owe it to them to consider what will their future look like in the next 10, 20, 50 years.
Thanks.
Thanks for your question, Dr. Dostoye. David, you have a question.
Yeah. Sarah, you mentioned something about varying the assessment so that students don't have access to all the answers from the previous term. And I've done that so far. So fall 21's assignment 1 is different from the winter. It'll be different in the spring, it'll be different in the fall. But at some point, I'm going to have to say enough is enough. I can't keep up. I'm spending all my time making up new questions and new answers. Only a finite number of things I can ask. There's got to be some repetition somewhere. So what I'm relying on is the control the attitude that says people need to cheat. Because if they want to cheat, they can. And if I have to do all the work to prevent it, it's just too much.
No, I think you bring up an absolutely valid point. And I don't think we have to do all of the work to prevent cheating, because, you know, we can't design out a cheating from our assessments. But yeah, I mean, I run into the same thing in my own courses, right? I mean, I actively continue to teach as well, so I come up against the same thing. And sometimes I'm assigned courses where I have the agency to design my own assessments. Sometimes I'm assigned courses that are multi-section courses, and they're overseen by a course coordinator, and I have no agency around the assessments. I'm there to deliver effectively a canned course, which is a lot less fun and a lot less creative. And in some cases, they carry forward their assessments from one year to the next. So I wouldn't mean to say that all of the onus should be on you as an instructor or us as instructors generally to keep ensuring that students don't cheat. Might be on us to think about more, kind of going back to that question of ensuring students are learning. In courses where I have the agency to decide my own assessments, I'm trying to get away from written assignments. And I say that as somebody with a humanities background. I came into social sciences during my doctorate, but to get away from assignments where students aren't writing, to have them do oral exams or voice threads or things that, like other things I mentioned. I haven't had students do the podcast yet, but I'm sure it's in my future. And going into a place that I actually find uncomfortable because I didn't get assessed that way, but giving students a chance. And sometimes I think asking students to have some input on the assessments themselves. So one of the systemic problems with this is that we need to prepare our course outlines ahead of time. They need to be approved by somebody, and then we're not supposed to deviate from those course outlines. What would it look like if we asked students what meaningful assessment would look like to them, and we had a chance to change some of it, so we're not front loading all the work ourselves, but engaging students as partners in the assessment process, right? So we still have this idea that I know best as a professor how to assess my students, and that is true to some extent. And I think there's probably also a place for students to have some engagement here. I don't know what it looks like yet. I've tried it a few times in grad courses, and it's worked really well. I think partly because I work in education, so my grad students are also educators, so they know what assessment looks like. It might not work as well in an undergrad course, it might not work as well in another discipline. When it's worked really well. I've also had it fail spectacularly. The idea of experimentation and allowing us as instructors to be able to experiment and fail. So I don't have an answer for you, but I continue to play with it in my own teaching practice.
Well, that point you raised about what do the students think, I've asked them of this specific question. They like this new pandemic solution I've had with 100% assessments. People say, we like the fact we can work on it as long as we like, it's open book and not to have exams. So that's going well. It's just a question, do I vary the assignments every single term I teach it? Because that's just a lot of work for me. And I don't think I will. I think after a couple of years, I'll just say, I can take the assignments used in some term from 2 years ago. They're not likely to be floating around. Because if somebody really wants to cheat, they'll cheat anyway. And so maybe the pandemic.
So David, I don't have the perfect answer for you, but I've popped a link in the chat from an American faculty member who teaches math, and they've been experimenting, for the want of a better word, with not changing their assignments, but changing how they grade. This isn't quite as far as ungrading, which is assigning no grades, but giving lots of feedback. So I would encourage you to have a look at that. The students are still working through problems, but I think one of the key components is having just really lightly reviewed this, and I'm not suggesting it'll work for you, but the whole idea that, David, you're the one that's doing the work. Here, let's let students do the work here. Let's make them responsible for their learning. One of the key tenets that Robert Talbert is the name of this faculty member talks about is reattempts without penalty. So if a student is unable to meet the specifications that you've outlined as far as competency is concerned, they're expected to go back and do the work again. So it's not about having a novel question that they can't understand, but it's in fact about shifting the onus on them to demonstrate in a really low stakes way that they've got that they're understanding, or that they've got comprehension of the concept in the way that you're considering. We're almost out of time, and so Sarah, this may be an unfair throw to you, but I did kind of promise that we talk a little bit about ideas or strategies that instructors might be able to do in their classes to decrease the likelihood of student deviations from academic honesty. I heard you've actually said them what I would imagine that you're going to say across a couple of your answers: student choice, flexible deadlines. These are two things that I've heard. Are there other things that you want to add to that?
A couple of other things come to mind. One is creating opportunities to talk with students over the semester. So not necessarily in a punitive way of just, like finger wagging and saying, here's our policies and don't cheat or I'll catch you. But rather, these are my expectations for ethical practice in my classroom. Here's what it means to uphold academic integrity, and have students engage in their own conversations about what this means to them. And then come back to it through the semester, creating opportunities for students to ask questions. That's clarifying questions, or if they're trying to puzzle through, is this, I've had grad students come to me and say, if I publish for my thesis in an article, is that self-plagiarism? Those are not questions I can answer in an email. I can, but it becomes, then they'll write back and say, too long, didn't read. But conversations where they can come back and engage with me in complex conversations and tease through some of the ethical complexities. So creating opportunities to talk, creating opportunities for students to learn through activities. So one of the things I do in my classes is I have an APA 7 activity where I actually give them a one-pager, and it's full of references that I pre-populate with errors and ask them to go and be a detective and find the errors, and then we go over it together. which was right and which was wrong. But that's a learning activity, but it's not graded. So I give them opportunities to practice through ungraded learning activities. And then also knowing where to refer students. So if a student needs writing help and it's way past what I can provide, that I have, time or capacity to provide, I refer them to the writing center. So I have those handy, and students might need a workshop on these kind of things. Sometimes also I need to refer students to wellness because their own anxiety around some of this stuff becomes paralytic and they can't function until they've seen someone at the wellness center. I'm very clear that I can be an academic advocate, but I can't be a counselor for them. And knowing where to refer students on our campuses, I think, is also helpful for us. There's probably a whole host of other ones, but does that kind of help to get things started?
Yeah, thank you. And I would also, wearing my Director of the Center for Innovation and Teaching and Learning hat, just say that your friendly Teaching and Learning Center has staff that would be happy to have those critical conversations and think about possible solutions to address these kinds of really integral and important questions. Sarah, thank you for your time. I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Dostalier to say a few words before we all leave.
Thanks a lot, Gavin. Well, Sarah, thank you. Thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about. This whole thing started in our faculty in a very interesting discussion we had at our faculty council meeting. So your presence here is the result of that. So you really have helped us and given us a lot to think about. So everyone, just a reminder that the session today, this event has been recorded, will be available on CITL's YouTube channel. So thank you everyone for your lively and very engaged participation. And Sarah, thanks again. Thanks, Gavin.